If you have seen our recent Demons of Skyrim video, you would know that I absolutely love poetic and legendary descriptions of histories, written words that make it seem like an epic story rather than a recital of names and places. The 36 Lessons of Vivec may be the longest of such stories and my personal favourite, but they would be followed closely by books such as the Songs of Pelennor and the Adabal Ar. These sources in particular talk of the great struggles between man and elf in ancient Cyrodiil. They are the stories of the Elysian Rebellion and the polarizing shift that would end the dominance of elvenkind in Tamriel. Welcome to Fudge Muppet, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Scott, and today we are talking about the Ayleid Sorcerer-Kings of legend, breaking down their descriptions, theorizing their backgrounds, but then of course we will be talking about the most famous of Ayleid champions, Umaril the Unfeathered, and we'll discuss his peculiar parentage. Let us begin. First, we have Haramir of Copper and Tea. Haramir fought Pelennor Whitestrake in a duel upon the famous Golden Hill, later known as Sankator. Copper and Tea is an interesting title, but it seems there is barely anything within the lore that expands upon this, leaving it up to us to speculate. With the not-so-bold assumption that this Haramir's Ayleid city-state was situated not too far from here, we could potentially explain the title Copper and Tea was granted to him because they were the main exports of his kingdom. The Colovian Highlands are home to many mines, and it would not be unlikely that these bountiful caverns provided abundant sources of copper, and tea is also often grown in hilly regions, allowing for greater drainage as to avoid flooding of the crops. But you may think it is strange that this tea would be grown at an altitude which is rather frigid. I'd personally put this down to various climate changes. For instance, during the events of Elder Scrolls 4, Sankator is a rather cold place. However, its depiction in the Elder Scrolls Online is that of a much warmer place. Then, you must consider that ancient Cyrodiil was said to have been a vast jungle, implying an environment that was much more lush and wet, which makes copper and tea two very likely resources. Another cool interpretation that I've heard of copper and tea is in reference to the sense of the area, or perhaps even Haramir himself. Ayleids have been known to be cruel, and they were infamous for their art tortures as well as their decadent culture. So imagine that the exotic palace of this Haramir guy always possessed a copper-like scent of blood from all of the time he spent creating art torches, but it's mixed with exotic fragrances of tea and spices that were the bountiful yields of Nedic slaves bound in chains. Perhaps he personally wore a tea-like perfume to mask the smell of blood. I do like that interpretation because it makes him seem so much more menacing. It's one of those uncomfortable contrasts that I really enjoy in characters. He smells beautiful from all the fragrances, but also he smells of murder. Though it would be he who was actually on the receiving end of a violent death. Pelennor tore into his neck with his teeth and ate Haramir's neck veins while screaming praise to Reman, a name no one knew yet. This Reman, of course, is the founder of the Second Empire, who would not be born for over 2,000 years. Interestingly, in the Remanada, a tale of Reman's conception and birth, it is said that King Hrol witnessed the spirit of Saint Alicia at Sankator, and he made love into the hill, but was killed in the process. The hill became pregnant, and 9 months later the small mound became a small mountain, and from it, Reman was born with the Amulet of Kings in his forehead. If you are skeptical of that story, that is entirely understandable, but regardless, Sankator was definitely the burial site of the Reman dynasty, so the place and name are connected, and Pelennor somehow knew thousands of years prior. That was a little tangent there, but you know, most Ayleid kings we know about were made famous by the fact that Pelennor Whitestrake killed them, so yeah, he's gonna come up a lot. Next, we have Gordhauer the Shaper. His head was smashed upon the goat-faced altar at Ninindava, an Ayleid city located in the Dural Mountains of Cyrodiil, presumably the place of which he was king. It is said that Pelennor said a small plague spell to keep the evil from reforming by Welkind magic. Welkind magic is clearly in reference to the Ayleids' Welkind stones made of meteoric glass that can store raw magicka within. To me at least, this story seems to imply that Gordhauer would have returned turned otherwise by using some kind of magic related to the Welkin stones, and I would think that this is referring to him as a lich. Perhaps he had some special made Welkin stone that served as a kind of phylactery which is needed for lichdom. Consider that there are many examples of Ayleid liches throughout the ruins of Cyrodiil and beyond. The likelihood of this potential reforming being a reference to necromantic lich rituals is also pretty high when you consider the goat-faced altar. It is known that many of the Ayleid kings made alliances with and worshipped various Daedric princes, and I would say it is likely this Gordhauer the Shaper did as well. Look at his title, the Shaper. In regards to other things that we know about the Ayleids, this could potentially mean he takes part in the many art tortures shaping flesh into grotesque arts like gut gardens and flesh sculptures. Then consider this goat-faced altar. If the goat was to fit any of the Daedric prince's typical descriptions, then I would say that Molag Bal is the perfect fit, as he's almost always shown with head horns and hooves. On top of this, you have Molag Bal, notorious for being one of the cruelest princes, fitting nicely with the idea that the title Shaper is referring to Ayleid art tortures, and then you also have Molag Bal's common associations with the undead. So the way I see it, Pellinal smashed the face of Gordhauer the Shaper into an altar of Molag Bal, and then used a spell to prevent his Welkin phylactery from being able to reform his body, permanently ending his evil reign. Interestingly, special white goats inhabit the area still. Listen to this description of the Ninandava sacred goat. The goats that come from the ruin of Ninandava in Cyrodiil are no mere domestic livestock. They have long been used in certain forbidden Daedric rituals, and have even been known to lead mortals through those arcane rites. I'd love to hear your speculation about these mysterious goats and their potential connection to Molag Bal. Next of the legendary Sorcerer-Kings is Hadhool, the Fire King. He was the ruler of Seatartar, an ancient Ayleid city-state that lies along the Gold Road between modern Skingrad and the Imperial City. In their native tongue, Ayleidun, it means Shadow of the Fatherwoods. It is a remarkably beautiful place that housed a particularly cruel ruler. It is said in the Adabal Ar that these were the realms of the Fire King Hadhool, where the begetting of drugs drawn from the admixture of daedrons into living hosts let one inhale new visions of torment, and children were set aflame for nighttime tiger sport. It is the most unpalatable of contrasts to know that this kind of cruelty was made in the presence of the most awe-inspiring beauties. Based upon Hadhool, you would half expect the interior of Seatartar to look like the Deadlands themselves, and yet this Ayleid city contained a great underground edifice with a central dome dedicated to Magnus, god of sight, light, and insight. Pools of magicka shimmered cold blue light onto the white walls of marble. Limpid canals, pools, and fountains flowed with the purest of magic, but this light could not hide the darkness of Fire King Hadhool. And so Pellinal slew the Fire King upon the granite steps of Seatartar. It was the first time Hadhool's spears would no refute. I should also note that in the mid-second era, his spirit returned to the ruins with the ghosts of his army and bound flame Atronachs, but he would be banished by a hero. Though it's interesting that the flame Atronachs were mentioned, I do wonder how far the flame theme for this Fire King went. It's a bit of a strange irony considering that the Ayleids considered fire to be a corrupt and weak form of light, yet he is known as the Fire King and was obsessed with the element, despite housing a grand temple to Magnus, god of light, in his home city. Maybe he was the king who switched the Ayleids of Seatartar from worship of Aedra, such as Magnus, to the Daedra, perhaps one such as Mehrunes Dagon. Now we must discuss a character I am not too sure about. Calephalel the Singer. I don't even know if this character is male or female, and I'm also unsure if they are a Sorcerer King. However, he or she does bear a legendary title, and it is written as if the reader should know who this is. In the Songs of Pellinal, it says, "When Huna, whom Pellinal raised from grain-slave to hoplite and loved well, took death from an arrowhead made from the beak of Calephalel the Singer, the white strake went on his first madness." In regards to the Ayleids, they are referenced with lots of bird-like imagery, and in general I think this comes from their foundation in Cyrodiil, which replaced the native bird people of the Isles, and also how they envision Auriel, an important elven god, as a large eagle-like creature. These avian motifs can be found in their architecture, their armor, their clothes, and their historical descriptions, so for this reason I believe an arrowhead made from the beak of is not literal, but rather a poetic description of a bow as a beak, and made from meaning born from or came from. Consider later in the Songs of Pelennor, Morahouse is being healed after having, quote, fallen to a volley of bird beaks, which implies he had fallen to a volley of Ayleid arrows. But in regards to this Ayleid character, Calephalel, the title singer, may be in reference to his or her skill with a bow. If the bow is considered a beak, then the whistling arrows that emerge from it could be likened to singing. Calephalel uses a bow, that much is sure, but still it is unknown whether he or she is one of the Sorcerer-Kings. Next is the Flower King Nilokai, of which we know pretty much nothing about. In fact, he is not even mentioned in the Songs of Pelennor, only the Adabal are, which says the Ayleids herded men from all across the Niben, including, quote, men of Gi, who were eventually destroyed when the Flower King Nilokai made great sacrifice to an insect god named Lost. By the way, that was lost in brackets, as in the name was lost to time. So let's break this down. Men of Gi would indicate to me some kind of reverence for the stars, as in the Magna-Gi, the spirits who followed Magnus and tore through the veil of Mundus to Aetherius, creating the stars. This kind of star worship is not unheard of with the early Nedic tribes, such as the celestial worshipping needs of the Deathlands or the Perenna tribe of Cyrodiil, who were known for their observations of stars and constellations. Beyond that, we cannot say much about these men of Gi, especially since they were all sacrificed by the Ayleid Flower King Nilokai to an unknown insect god. But what could be meant by Flower King, and who is this insect god? I think it would be proper to assume that this insect god is more likely of Daedric origin, considering that it is receiving sacrifice of an entire tribe of men. Perhaps, like the goat-faced altar potentially referencing Molag Bal, this insect god could be a manifestation of a certain Daedric prince. Then again, it could also be a lesser demi-prince of Oblivion, or a completely unknown god. Here's my take. I think by insect god, it means some kind of bee or wasp-looking thing, maybe a unique mix of insectoid features, but regardless, the reason I say this is because it could make a poetic connection to flowers. Here we have the Flower King Nilokai, and I imagine he has beautiful gardens of flowers and uses them to decorate, and it's known that bees pollinate flowers, so I imagine these buzzing gardens. But like the success of a garden is oft dependent on successful pollination, his kingdom too requires pollination. It needs its influence and power to spread, but like the flower, it needs help. But in this case, not from a bee, but an insect god. So the Flower King sacrifices whole tribes of men to this insect god in order to have a successful garden, the garden being a metaphor for his kingdom. Well, at least that's my take on it, but still a question remains. Who is this insect god? Well, if it is a demi-prince or some unknown god, then we have little chance of finding out. But if we were to connect this insect god to a Daedric prince, we can see if there is any crossover in their spheres and themes. If we were to look at solely aesthetic similarities, then Mephala the web spinner and Namira associated with spiders, insects, and slugs come to mind. However, I don't think they quite fit the theme of sacrificing in order to achieve beauty and affluence of an Ayleid kingdom. Mephala is far more subtle, and Namira is all about revulsion. You have to remember that the appearances of the Daedric princes can change at their discretion, though of course they generally have preferences. It's entirely possible for any of the Daedric princes to present themselves in the fashion of an insect god. If we were to play on the idea of vanity and beauty for this Flower King and his kingdom, then perhaps Azura fits the bill best. She, after all, fits the theme and is also depicted with a crown of flowers. Maybe that's something that the Flower King actually wore himself. Perhaps this insect god could have been Sanguine, as a fat bumblebee who gifted Nilokai Sanguine's rose, an item that earned him the moniker Flower King. And Sanguine's sphere of hedonism fits with Ayleid culture quite well. Remember, this is all theorizing and headcanon at this point, but it's unlikely we'll get an answer for such a specific question, so it's all we can do. I thought it would probably also be worth mentioning the Fat Mother, a Nedic tale of a fat woman who was turned into a giant bee deity and is considered one of the 4 mythological parents of ancient Nedic tribes. The Fat Mother is really the only deity I know of that is described as an insect explicitly, aside from Mephala as a spider, but I don't think the Fat Mother that nourishes the Nedic people is the same insect god that Nilokai sacrifices needs to. I ultimately think that Azura or Sanguine fits best thematically, but I'd love to hear what you think down below. There are more Sorcerer-Kings that we know of, such as Leloriar and Dinar of Nenalata, King Narelmor of Garlus Malata, King Senedelin of Deladil, and King Umaril of Abergalus. But the nature of these kings is mostly clear from the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, and beyond these, there are most definitely more Ayleid Sorcerer-Kings that have not yet been named, and perhaps never will. But above all of these kings, it is Umaril the Unfeathered, champion of the Ayleids and nemesis of Pelennor Whitestrake, that would be the most infamous Ayleid of the histories.
He is the enemy of all who walk free on Tamriel today, a survivor of the ancient race of Ayleid slave masters who once ruled Cyrodiil. He was struck down by Pelennor, but by his art Umaril had bound himself to the realm of his mistress, the Daedra Lord Meridia. So he was not slain, but simply cast adrift upon the waters of Oblivion. Now he has returned to seek vengeance upon the gods who helped bring about his downfall so many ages ago.
As the prophet says, Umaril escaped death at the hands of Pelennor. It is said in a deal with Meridia, Umaril was granted immortality, and upon his defeat, he would reform in Meridia's realm, the Coloured Rooms, and he would return with a vengeance thousands of years later, yet he would ultimately be defeated by the hero of Kvatch, who donned the Crusaders' relics and received the blessing of Talos, which was the final ingredient, allowing him to permanently kill Umaril in the spirit plane. However, Umaril's death is nowhere as interesting as his birth. Due to Umaril's golden Auroran-like appearance, many have led to believe that Umaril's half-elf status is that of half-elf, half-Auroran, aka half-Daedra. His close association with Meridia would make this a good theory. However, what he says in the Songs of Pelennor paints a different story. The half-elf showed himself bathed in meridian light, and he listed his bloodline in the Ayleid and spoke of his father, a god of the previous Kalpa's world river, and taking great delight in the heavy breathing of Pelennor, who had finally bled. Umaril specifically states his divine father, a god from a previous Kalpa. For those who are not familiar, in the Elder Scrolls, a Kalpa is essentially an incarnation of the universe, which includes the birth, life, and death of a world. It is speculated that the chaos of the Dawn Era is the ending of a previous Kalpa and the beginning of a new. Many Tamrielic mythologies share this notion of Kalpa, such as Alduin the World-Eater of Nord mythology, who will destroy the world to make room for a new one, or Satakal, the world skin of Yakutan mythology, but this idea that Umaril's father is a god from a previous Kalpa leaves us with far more questions than it does answers. How did his father survive the end of the previous universe? Where is his father now? What's a world river? Was his father of Adric or Daedric origin? Or neither? It's a peculiar situation, but maybe while we dwell on that for a second, let's talk about this unfeathered title. As we've discussed previously with the other Ayleid kings, bird-like imagery, feathers, beads, beaks, and so on have been used in conjunction with their armor, their architecture, and their poetic descriptions. The purpose of the title Unfeathered is most certainly to distinguish Umaril as a not-so-normal Ayleid, standing out among his feathered brothers and sisters. This could of course be taken quite literally, saying that he does not use feather adornments, but I am more inclined to think otherwise. I believe Unfeathered is in relation to his status as half-elf, having a divine father. Perhaps to be feathered is a rite of passage for Ayleid youth, and Umaril never took this rite rite of passage, perhaps he bypassed it because of his divine heritage. Or maybe to be feathered is to be mortal to the Ayleids, tangible and temporary, whereas to be unfeathered would to be ethereal and everlasting. There are many potential interpretations. I really hope Kalpas are something that we hear more about in future entries to the Elder Scrolls series, because it would potentially answer a lot of questions we have about Umaril. I mean, the impact of his birth is pretty significant, a trans-universal union of elf mother of this Kalpa and divine father of a previous Kalpa. If this is all true, then the precedent creates some interesting possibilities for the Elder Scrolls. Ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the end of the video, but please do like the video if you enjoy deep dive digging into the obscure parts of the Elder Scrolls lore, and please go down into the comments below and get theory crafting. I'd love to hear your takes on everything we discussed. It's videos like these that just make me wish so much that there was an Elder Scrolls game set in the early First Era. It's just some of my favorite lore, but I doubt that will ever happen. That aside, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching this piece on the Ayleid Sorcerer-Kings. Who's your favorite? Mine is probably the Flower King Nilokai, but followed very closely by Haramir of Copper and Tea. Let me know yours down in the comments below. My name is Scott from Fudge Muppet. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.